Yeah, even though it's less gloomy, but it's still gloomy this year. And can you explain?
We see a tough year ahead for the global economy, but there are signs of resilience. So we have upgraded our growth for 2023. Previously it was 2.7%, we've upgraded it to 2.9%. And importantly, we expect growth to bottom out this year, which means for the end of the year we expect to see improvement and into 2024 when growth will go up to 3.1%.
Going up, and are there any specific reason for it?
So the upgrade that we have of 2.9% from 2.7% comes partly from China, which is China reopened quite suddenly towards the end of last year. And we expect to see growth come back and somewhat strongly, especially starting on the second quarter of this year, as private consumption recovers and you have higher mobility in China. In addition, in Europe, the winter was less severe than we were expecting, and energy prices have also come down. So these forces help the global economy to some extent, and which is why we had the upward revision.
How do you think about the American economy right now and the labor market of America?
Labor markets in America are still quite tight. The unemployment rate is at a record low of 3.5%. But we expect to see labor markets soften. So we can see unemployment rate in the US going up to say around 5% or slightly higher into 2024. So that would mean that there would be a more challenging labor market than what we have in the US right now.
Sometimes I'm a bit confused of it. Somebody said it's good and somebody said it's bad.
I think what we would all like is to have high levels of employment in the economy, that everybody is looking for a job can find a job. What we want to prevent, though, is a situation where wage pressures become very large, so that then it ends up with higher price pressures in the economy. Central banks around the world are trying to do is to soften that pace so that at least wage pressures don't become very severe, because otherwise we will live with high inflation for a very long time, and that's just bad, not just for cost of living, but it's also bad for the labor market, because eventually you will see businesses suffering from this and households suffering from it. We would have the concern about having both high inflation with very weak growth. So it's very important to bring down inflation durably.
This time it's Korea, yeah. Even though IMF slightly increased the growth rate, but the Korean one is going down.
So compared to last year, there is much more tightening of financial conditions globally and also in Korea. So because of that, we are seeing some slowing down in the economy, also coming from weakness in external demand. So if you look at the data for the last quarter of last year, there was negative growth, and that had to do with weakness in external demand, a worsening trade balance. That was the primary factor. Now there are some early signs of softening private consumption. That is probably going to continue into this year. The other sector that is slowing down is the real estate sector in Korea. That is another area where adjustment is happening. But we think that this is the adjustment that's required to bring down inflation durably. And this is a healthy adjustment to happen. But then later on, we could see signs of recovery. So therefore, we will see growth slow down. But at the same time, we do see that in the second half, that growth will start looking up again for Korea, and one of the positive spillovers comes from the recovery in China.
I just want to ask you the policy evaluation or suggestion.
So in the case of monetary policy, I agree with Governor Ree in terms of the trade-offs that have to be faced, which is you want to bring inflation down. The good news is that we think that inflation will gradually decline this year, especially core inflation. So we should expect that to go down. But you have to be data dependent and you have to go by what you're seeing in these different pieces of information, the real activity on inflation, on the housing sector.
And now we increase the price of the gas or electricity. How do you think about the government's energy policy, especially South Korea?
So the government right now wants to do a very targeted support approach, and that we would agree with, which is that our advice is for countries to provide targeted support on a temporary basis, so to provide it to the vulnerable households and not to provide it more broad-based manner. That's important for fiscal prudence. It's important given the inflation environment that the country is facing. So I think that temporary and target is the right way to go.
What kind of uncertainty might be most important, or do you value or concern or pay attention to?
So there are several risks. One of the risks is from if it turns out that inflation is actually much more persistent, much more stubborn, then central banks around the world will have to raise rates even more. I think that can lead to corrections in markets, and you could end up with a much faster tightening of global financial conditions, which has implications for the US, but also for the rest of the world. A second risk is with respect to the war. The war is not over. We could see a further escalation, sanctions and counter-sanctions. That has implications for the global economy. China, the virus seems to be running through the economy right now, but at the same time we have seen infections come down. So in our baseline scenario, we have that the health crisis resolves itself relatively quickly and we see a resumption in private consumption. But if that's not the case, then that would be another downside risk. And lastly, geo-economic fragmentation is something that we are quite concerned about, that countries are turning more protectionist, which is they want to move production back home. That we know is going to be damaging for the global economy. I think it is very important to make sure that inflation comes down durably. There is a bit of a disconnect between what markets are expecting in the US and what the Federal Reserve has communicated it will do. So that's an environment in which if it turns out that inflation is even stronger, then markets will have to correct itself. And that we know can have spillovers to the rest of the world. So it is one of the important concerns we have. The IMF continues to learn from its experiences of the past and of course learns from all the knowledge that gets generated with all the research that happens both at the IMF but also externally. So we adapt with incoming knowledge, learn from both our mistakes and from the successes that we have in how we've evolved our view. But I think we just have a much better understanding now of how inequality and poverty can affect macro variables, including the ability functioning of monetary policy and fiscal policy. So in our programs, for instance, we make sure that even if a country is reducing fiscal spending, it's important that they provide for the most vulnerable people social safety nets. More generally, climate has become a big issue for us to deal with because many countries are getting hit with climate shocks and they're having external financing problems that come with it. So we're focused on climate, digital money, digital currencies, another big issue. So as the new topics have come up, we have expanded our work in all these important areas. Equal access to opportunity when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to financial literacy, all of this is absolutely critical to be able to reduce inequality. We've seen countries where the intergenerational mobility has come down because of differences in access to these kinds of opportunities, and that's important to fix. Of course, the particular policies you have on the fiscal side, whether it comes to tax policy and expenditure policy, also play a very important role. I loved Parasite.
Parasite.
I watched Squid Games.
You might like.